Having a review with your existing customer, especially a multi-line customer, is so important. It's important for retention. It's important for customer service. So I always like to open up the conversation in a multi-line agency by saying, we're going to do things a little bit differently today at your renewal and during this review conversation. Our agency is going to first assess what your liability limits should be on your policies, because we know that your life is constantly changing, and we haven't had the conversation with you in 6 months, a year, however long it was since you last talked to the customer. So now, understanding that your world changes, we sell things, we acquire things, I want to make sure that we got the proper liability coverage in place. So now you engage the customer right out of the gate during the review process of identifying what that need should be. Once you start in that conversation, you let the customer know, these questions are going to help me really identify these numbers. Let's start off with making sure that you didn't purchase any new autos. Okay, so now you identify any new autos in the household. Then we follow up by asking them whether or not they have any secondary items that you should be aware of, secondary vehicles, such as motorcycles, boats, watercrafts. You get any of those toys since the last time we talked? Those are more assets we just find. Then we identify any additional children living in the household. Why do we need to know that? Because today's world in the multi-line agency, we got to make sure that the young drivers are protected correctly. But now you're building a real profile on the customer to understand if they have life insurance or if they have children in the household, which always leads to that life insurance need. The next question we always follow up with the customer after identifying children is whether or not they own their home, and if they still own their home, what value would they give that home, because we want to make sure we're assessing the proper value. After asking the home question, you always follow up by identifying if there's a mortgage balance, because you're trying to identify the equity. That's the best time to ask in the review whether or not they own life insurance to protect the remaining balance of the mortgage. After you've identified whether or not they've owned life insurance, it's your opportunity, if you want to cross-sell at that point, have a conversation, or just keep on gathering all this great data and facts by having this conversation with your customer. Leads into the next question, which is secondary homes, additional properties. Again, if you're just reviewing a motorcycle, even if you're just reviewing the homeowners or just the auto, you still are identifying additional properties, because those are assets if they've acquired over the last 6 months to a year. And then follow up with the simple question with asking them their employment status. Are they still working? Are they retired? And understanding, where they're at in their world. And then follow up by asking, as far as assets, do you have any 401ks, IRAs, CDs, annuities? And what would you put as far as a value when you have this type of conversation, with the customer? Once you've identified that value with the customer, now you have one of the most perfect profiles of understanding what your customer needs are in the review process. So making sure you have a review conversation, building identity, with that customer, and identifying those opportunities in life and retirement, and really understanding who your customer is, all comes through the renewal process and having a great review with them. Bringing up the liability limits with a customer in the review is so simple. We start off by talking about their liability limits with them in the review process. We don't talk about their rate. We don't talk about what the premium's going down or what it's going up. We start off by saying to the customer, we do things differently at our review. We're first going to start off by reviewing your liability limits, because we always know your world is constantly changing. You're bringing assets into the household, and the assets are going outside of the household. So we want to sit down and really understand and see if there's been any changes. While we're having this conversation about your liability, we also are going to be looking for additional discounts that we can offer inside of the policies that we're having the conversation about. Because finding additional multi-line products to have a cross-sell conversation always brings more bundling, and more bundling always brings better rates to the bottom line to the consumer. So again, understanding and identifying your customer's liability limits is going to open up a lot of sales opportunities. So that's how we bring up the liability right out of the gate, letting them know that we're going to hone in on this number before we start talking about rates, before we start talking about product, and really understand what's changed in their world. So in a multi-line agency, we always have customers that are getting rate increases. It's just part of the industry, right? It's a big circle. Rates go up, rates come down, customers shop. It's a very commoditized market in the multi-line channel. So when we sit down with a customer that's having a rate increase, we start off by letting the customer know, before we start talking about your pricing, we're going to talk and make sure that all the coverages are in place the way they should be, so we have the correct number that we're going to be giving to you. Starting that conversation off by identifying the liability limits, you have a great opportunity now to not only identify and understand who the customer is, but also now start talking about liability limits. And you'll find that majority of your customers are probably going to get a bump in their liability coverages because they haven't really had this conversation before. So before you know it, you're bringing them more value, you're upselling them liability limits, and then when it comes time to talk about the pricing, you've already built rapport with the customer. They've gotten more value from that conversation, and now it's no longer about price. It's about bringing the right value to that customer, and they appreciate you starting off with the liability conversation.